President Trump says no to dreamers.
We cannot admit everyone who would like to come here.
Protests at the White House include Catholics.
How often in the Old Testament, does God say to Moses, protect the stranger, help those who are in need?
Hope after Hurricane Harvey.
David to his disciples, saying,
How Catholics are lending helping hands. Our report from Texas. And meet one young nun who's praising God her way. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, September 5th, 2017. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. President Trump defends his decision to phase out a program that protects up to 800,000 young immigrants from deportation, while former President Barack Obama says the decision to roll back his Dreamers Act is cruel and self-defeating. We have team coverage with reaction from Capitol Hill and protests nationwide. But first, correspondent Mark Irons is at the White House with the president's controversial decision. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Lauren. Hundreds of protesters outside the White House loudly reject the president's action today, and Catholic bishops across the country oppose the decision to phase out DACA. The program has protected hundreds of thousands of dreamers from deportation, but today the Trump administration says DACA is against the law. Protesters outside the White House today condemned President Trump's call to end DACA and his punt to Congress to take action. Inside the White House,
the president's DACA decision today brings us closer to a safer, fairer, and legal immigration system.
White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders defending the case made earlier in the day by Trump's Attorney General Jeff Sessions. Sessions says the Obama administration's 2012 decision to implement DACA was an unconstitutional exercise of authority, and the Department of Justice advised the president to wind down the program for dreamers.
This does not mean they are bad people or that our nation disrespects or demeans them in any way. It means we are properly enforcing our laws.
In a statement, President Trump says, "I do not favor punishing children, most of whom are now adults, for the actions of their parents. But we must also recognize that we are a nation of opportunity because we are a nation of laws." The Trump administration gives Congress 6 months to come up with a legislative fix to DACA before the government stops renewing permits for those covered by the program. Speaker Paul Ryan wants the House and Senate to craft a solution for dreamers. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops call the president's decision unacceptable, saying, "The cancellation of the DACA program is reprehensible. It causes unnecessary fear for DACA youth and their families." Ashley Feasley, the director of migration policy for the U.S. Bishops Conference, says it's critical that Congress take immediate action.
The bishops are in support and solidarity with DACA youth. They see them every day in their parishes, and they're a really important part of America.
Cardinal Donald Wuerl, the Archbishop here in the nation's capital, along with bishops in Arizona and New Mexico, are just a few of the bishops defending DACA. White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders does say it's a misconception that the end of DACA means that those in the program will soon be deported. Lauren.
With all that's going on, the hurricane flood relief, the debt ceiling, tax reform, where does this rank on the president's list of priorities?
DACA won't be the most important thing as a packed September commences. President Trump also met today with Republican lawmakers on another top priority, rewriting the U.S. tax code. But there are deep divisions within Congress when it comes to reforming immigration policy, so passing laws may be difficult.
Correspondent Mark Irons at the White House. Thank you, Mark. We turn tonight to one dreamer's story. He came to the White House in the early morning hours to raise his voice in hopes of saving the program that's made his life in the U.S. possible. But after today's decision, the son of Mexican immigrants fears his future won't remain in the land of the free. Jason Calvi reports.
Show me how democracy looks like. This is what democracy.
Protesters urge President Trump to say yes to DACA.
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
President Obama's 2012 move shielded nearly 800,000 young immigrants from deportation. People like Carlos Arellano.
It's not my fault that I was brought here by my parents and that I had to pay the consequences.
His parents left Mexico when he was 15 years old. The 31-year-old college senior says DACA opened the door to his dream to become a nurse. He says it allowed him to get a driver's license, work permit, and Social Security number.
I believe that what liberty stands for, the lady liberty stands for give me your wig, give me those that want freedom.
And Franciscan priests pray for people like Carlos.
These are our children. They're a part of our community. Again, part of the mission of us as a church is to proclaim the good news to the poor.
Misael Garcia runs a construction company in Baltimore. He says his American dream could be demolished.
I've been able to create a future for myself, you know. I was in the process of actually buying my first house now. So with this decision, I don't know where that's going to happen.
But he will continue raising his voice.
Everyone here, I'm really hurt.
And that tough road now leads right here to the Capitol. The president says it's Congress's job to figure out exactly what to do. Already today, we saw Republican Senator Lindsey Graham and Democratic Senator Dick Durbin make a pitch for their bill to protect these young immigrants. Lauren?
The issue is quite controversial, to say the least, with differing viewpoints on both sides of the aisle. Now, who are the biggest Trump supporters of this program, Jason?
One Christian group, Faith and Freedom Coalition, says the move is compassionate because it'll prevent mass deportation and upholds the rule of law. Republicans here at the Capitol supporting the president say the law of the land has to be followed. They say President Obama didn't have constitutional authority to issue DACA without Congress's approval.
Correspondent Jason Calvi at the Capitol, thank you. Joining us now is Alfonso Aguilar, president of the Latino Partnership for Conservative Principles, a Washington-based advocacy group. Thank you for joining us.
Happy to be with you.
You are on the record criticizing the president's decision. Why?
Well, look, I wasn't happy the way DACA was created. It wasn't created in a constitutionally appropriate way. President Obama should have gone through the legislature. But once created, it benefited over 800,000 people who entered the country illegally when they were minors through no fault of their own. They've grown up here. They're part of our communities. Many of them don't even speak the language of their home country.
And we've seen through the video in the show earlier in that one man's journey that this is a very important program to them. What do you think should be done now?
Well, look, now that it's going to be rescinded, I think Congress should move to pass legislation to provide these individuals who benefited from DACA a permanent status. But I think for it to happen, I think we need the president. And he tweeted this morning saying that it was now the role of the responsibility of Congress to do something.
But what does that mean?
That's why the president has to go a little bit further and say, if he were to say, I support DACA and I want Congress to pass I support the DREAM Act, and I want Congress to pass the DREAM Act, that will go a long way to help Congress, a Republican Congress, pass a DREAM Act that would provide permanent status to the undocumented.
So let's be clear here. The Dreamers, we want a DREAM Act, or you want a DREAM Act that would do what?
The DREAM Act, remember, DACA, what DACA does is provide relief from deportation.
Right.
Doesn't give him legal status. It does give him an employment authorization document that allows him to work. Under a DREAM Act...
And the president has said we're not doing that anymore.
Because I don't have the discretion.
And now Congress is tasked with coming up with a DREAM Act.
Okay, a DREAM Act would actually provide legal status, a permanent legal status, so they can stay here in the country, live here and work here permanently, hopefully even an eventual path to citizenship. But in a Republican Congress, it would go a long way if the White House gives a green light to the DREAM Act, because that would provide cover, political cover, to the more conservative members to support it.
But you are conservative, and these conservative members are not going to get on board with this. Is that right? And what do you do next?
I think that some would be willing to support the DREAM Act. From my conversation with them, they understand that in the case of the Dreamers, those who entered here when they were minors, I think it's different from the rest of the undocumented population. But I think it will go a long way for those members who are facing re-election next year if the president gives them support and says, you know what, I support the DREAM Act.
Thank you so much, Alfonso Aguilar, president of the Latino Partnership for Conservative Principles.
Pleasure.
Florida, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico have all declared states of emergency as Hurricane Irma gathers strength and turns into a Category 5 storm. It's roaring toward the islands in the Northeast Caribbean. The U.S. National Hurricane Center said Irma is the most powerful seen in the Atlantic in more than a decade and is potentially catastrophic. It could have maximum winds of 180 miles per hour. While Florida waits for Irma to land, volunteers along the Texas Gulf Coast roll up their sleeves and go back to work to clean up widespread damage following Hurricane Harvey. Some areas are still underwater, and tens of thousands are not able to return to their homes. The Archbishop of Galveston, Houston, is offering a message of hope, saying God hears the prayers of his faithful. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby spoke with him in Texas this weekend. Wyatt.
Lauren, His Eminence says despite the tragedy, the loss, the devastation, the Lord is acting with and through his faithful. He tells me the biggest sign of this, the overwhelming response by volunteers who have united from every race and creed to help others.
Responding with charity and joy.
Cardinal Daniel DiNardo offering a message of hope to members of St. Ignatius of Loyola Catholic Church in Spring, Texas, just 25 miles from downtown Houston. Several hundred parishioners gathered for Mass at a local high school. The church, as we showed you last week, look at this water, it's all pouring out, took on filthy, smelly bayou water and won't be ready for Mass for months.
I think it's important for the priest, obviously the parish, but also the shepherd, the local shepherd, the bishop, to get around, to try to gather the people together, comfort them, challenge them too, but also let them know that they're in our hearts and minds.
His Eminence's unannounced visit was a welcome surprise to members of his flock and a blessing to John and Christine Keenan, who had to be rescued by boat after their house flooded.
Things like this pick you back up. It was great that he came and spent the time. I mean, I'm sure he's got his things going, and you know, the church is devastated, and it brings the community back.
Earlier in the day, John and Christine showed us their home, which had never flooded before. They lost 2 cars and numerous personal family items. But Christine says members of the church came to their rescue.
Wednesday morning, right away, St. Ignatius men and women started arriving.
Parishioners have even volunteered to give them a place to stay while they work on repairing the house. Father Norbert Meduja, who rescued the Blessed Sacrament, feels the presence of God.
And I'm just overwhelmed at the community and the support and, you know, the joy that people are feeling that we came together as quickly as possible to celebrate the Holy Mass.
Well, as I mentioned, our EWTN News Nightly crews waded through the waters last week with Father Norbert as he showed us the extent of the flood damage to his church. While we were there, my colleague Paul Fifield took a picture on his phone of the flooding. So I want you to take a careful look at this. Since St. Ignatius posted Paul's picture on social media, Catholics have pointed out that the flood waters appear to be in the shape of the Virgin Mary. Some say you can even make out her veil. We'll let you decide on that, Lauren, but perhaps, if so, it's another good sign for their church.
That's incredible. Now, Wyatt, this is your hometown. You went back, you saw all the streets, you saw your grade school, you talked to your family, friends. What struck you the most about going back to Houston?
Well, there was something in the conversation I had with Cardinal DiNardo where he said that really resonated with me, which is how Houstonians came out and really came together during a time of crisis. Because as you had said, Paul Fifield and I traveled all around Houston, north and south, and frankly, what made me most proud was see Houstonians and see fellow Texans coming out, and when people were in their most time of need, their worst time ever, lowest point, they came out and really helped their neighbor.
And a lot of that, too, was Catholic support.
Absolutely.
You did such a great job, Wyatt, both you and Paul, in covering this story from a Catholic perspective. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Catholic Charities USA is one of the groups helping victims get back on their feet. The head of the agency just delivered a $2 million check to Texas.
We haven't even begun to know what's coming in the mail. This is online donations. So my happy job right now is to get those dollars out to the people, deliver it immediately.
Catholic Charities is also delivering relief supplies, and Sister Donna Markham says she'll distribute more money to help hurricane victims later this month. It's going to include the donations collected at parishes in the next 2 weeks around the country. North Korea says its latest explosion was a hydrogen bomb that can be attached to a missile. North Koreans celebrated the country's 6th nuclear test, which follows several recent long-range missile tests. U.S. President Donald Trump says he has given the go-ahead for Japan and South Korea to buy a substantially increased amount of sophisticated military equipment from the United States. German Chancellor Angela Merkel has condemned North Korea's latest nuclear test as a flagrant violation of international conventions, but said there can only be a diplomatic and peaceful solution to the crisis. And Russian President Vladimir Putin says this could be a global catastrophe. He has called for talks with North Korea, warning against military hysteria. Pope Francis's visit to Colombia begins tomorrow. Last night, he sent a video message to the Colombians.
Y también para aprender de vuestra caridad y vuestra constancia en busca de la paz y la armonía.
Pope Francis invited all Colombians to take the first step in reaching out to their neighbor in a sign of peace, and he thanked those who welcomed me to your land and into your heart for their many efforts to prepare his visit. Coming up, a priest in Nigeria gunned down in cold blood, and a Kansas nun who celebrates her brother, the first U.S.-born martyr. State police in southwestern Nigeria have confirmed that a Catholic priest has been murdered. Father Cyriacus Unkwo was abducted Friday from his car in the town of Iwo. No arrests have been made. This comes on the heels of a shooting spree at a Catholic mass last month. That's according to local reports, and it killed more than 8 people. The grave of a Cameroonian bishop has been desecrated. 58-year-old Bishop Bala's grave in Bafia's San Sebastian Cathedral had traces of blood on it. The Cameroonian Bishops' Conference says he was murdered in May, and civil authorities do not believe that that's the case. Tonight, we mourn the death of Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor.
And to be grateful to the Lord for his goodness and his presence and the hope that he gives to all our people.
Cardinal O'Connell worked for Christian unity, particularly with the Anglican Church in England. He was rector of the Venerable English College and spent 35 years as a bishop. O'Connor was one of the last bishops appointed by Paul VI. Christians in Iraq are dwindling in numbers. So what's the solution? As part of our continuing coverage on Christian persecution, we discussed the Kurds' plan to hold a referendum on independence from Iraq later this month. The U.S. State Department has expressed concerns over the vote, and Turkey believes it could lead to a civil war. Our next guest believes a fully independent Kurdistan from Iraq is the solution to help Christians in the area. Joining me now is Stephen Hollingshead, Managing Director of Iraq Haven, a project to reverse genocide of Christians in the Middle East. And it is under the direction of In Defense of Christians. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Lauren.
You just returned from meeting government officials in Kurdistan, and you believe Kurdistan's independence from Iraq will help them. Why?
Well, first of all, the Kurds are the best actor in the neighborhood as far as the Christians are concerned. The Christians running away from ISIS ran into the arms of Kurdistan. The majority of the Christians in Iraq live in Kurdistan. The Kurds are not perfect, but they're by far the most pro-U.S., by the way, and benign force in the neighborhood.
Well, what is really happening, this is what you say, is that there's a proxy war between Erbil,
yes,
capital of Kurdistan, and Baghdad, capital of Iraq, which is hurting the chance of Christians to move back into these villages. When I was there, Christians were struggling to return. What is the problem here?
The Nineveh Plain, the traditional Christian area going back to the 1st century, is essentially divided north and south. And the Kurdish Peshmerga have occupied the north. The Iraqi central government, but especially at their behest, the Shia militias who are paid by Iran, have occupied the the southern half of the Nineveh Plain, and they are moving in into these formerly Christian villages where people were chased out by ISIS. They're moving in.
You know, I was there on the lines with the Peshmerga who were protecting some of these villages in the north from ISIS. ISIS at the time was still in the south. So why does Kurdistan becoming its own entity help with keeping the Iranians out of the Christian Holy Land?
We need an international safe zone. The Kurds will have a big part of that border, and of course have been fighting ISIS and are happy to participate in a coalition. But the internal security needs to be performed by the indigenous minorities who are from there and who can go back. And so the United States should establish this international, be the leaders of this international safe zone, but they should insist that Baghdad stop the occupation and get the Iranians to get the Shia militias out of there so that Christian families can return to their homes.
So there is a lot riding on this bid, September 25th, for Kurdistan's independence. I
don't see any moral difference between the Kurdish right to independence and our own in 1776.
Thank you so much. Stephen Hollingshead, in defense of Christians.
Thank you, Lauren.
A Kansas nun says she didn't know her brother very well, but she will be at his beatification. Father Stanley Rother is going to be the first American-born martyr. Sister Marita Rother will be among those participating on September 23rd in Oklahoma City. Stanley Rother ministered in Guatemala during its civil war and was targeted for death by the government because of the church's insistence on catechizing. Pope Francis acknowledged Rother's martyrdom in December. Up next, the Sistine Choir is coming to America. We'll tell you how to get tickets. Plus a modern-day musical tribute to the Pope. It's been 1 year since the canonization of St. Teresa of Calcutta, and today, for the first time, the Catholic Church celebrates her feast day. Mother Teresa was canonized by Pope Francis in St. Peter's Square 1 year ago, and today's feast is being marked with celebrations worldwide. Monsignor Anthony Figueredo from the Vatican's Office for Integral Human Development knew Mother Teresa, and he joins us now from Rome. Monsignor, welcome back to the program.
Thank you. It's a beautiful day here in Rome. It's as if Mother Teresa is lighting the darkness of those here on earth as she promised.
Oh, wonderful. Well, how is she being celebrated in Rome and around the world today?
Well, exactly 20 years that she went to the Lord. Her last words, Lauren, Jesus, I love you, Jesus, I love you. And so around the world, she's being celebrated majestically, I would say. In Calcutta, she's being proclaimed the co-patroness of the Archdiocese, along with St. Francis Xavier. In the capital of Kosovo, Pristina, a cathedral is being dedicated to her in a city which is 90% Albanian Muslim. In many cities of the United States too, but here in Rome, there was a very special celebration at the Marian Sanctuary of Divine Love. I was there, the relics were there, many, many people, and I want to tell your viewers that I prayed for them especially. All the viewers, all at EWTN,
Wonderful.
all their
Thank
intercessions
you.
were remembered before the relics.
Thank you. You know, you met Mother Teresa. I wish I had that opportunity. What effect did she have on your life?
You know, I was born just with one hand, and I wanted to know from a saint what is the meaning of suffering. So I asked Mother Teresa, why one hand? And she said to me, you know, I have a big hand, you have a small hand. In the eyes of God, they're all hands. And I often think about that, you know, in terms of abortion, the handicapped, the disabled. We're all children of God, no matter what our incidentals are. And then she said to me, you know, Father, you need to take the small fingers of your hand before you go to bed every night, and you've got to pray the gospel of the 5 fingers. I didn't know what that gospel was, but she told me what it was. Jesus, you did this for me. Taken from the gospel of Matthew 25. In other words, the cross that God has given us, the suffering, is not against us, but it's to bring us closer to Jesus and to bring others closer to Jesus by the message of hope and love that we share with them from our own experience.
Monsignor, what a beautiful story. Thank you so much for joining us. Monsignor Anthony Figueredo from the Vatican's Office of Integral Human Development.
Thank you.
Catholic bishops of Scotland consecrated the country to the Immaculate Heart of Mary on Sunday, and thousands came to celebrate. Bishops prayed for Scotland at the Marian Shrine at the Carfin Grotto, asking that the country be a place where all people are valued, a place where poor, lonely, and marginalized people are not forgotten, and a place where people are free to practice their faith. A big treat for those of us in the United States. The oldest choir, dating back to the first centuries of the church, is coming to New York City, Washington, D.C., and Detroit. This group of 30 boys and 22 men sing for the Holy Father regularly. They will come to the U.S. for the first time in 30 years. Now they're performing in New York City on September 16th at St. Patrick's Cathedral, in Washington, D.C. at the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception on September 20th at 6 p.m. and at the Detroit Opera House on September 23rd. You can go to SistinaChapelUSTour.com to get the tickets to see them. And does this nun sing? But it's not that kind of music. Sister Maria Valentina, a Colombian nun turned rapper, in her sports sneakers, plans to perform for Pope Francis when he visits Colombia this week. The 28-year-old says it's an opportunity to show him our love the way that we know, which is through music. And the nun says she likes the rebellious spirit of rap, that it jives with Francis's own call to youth to make trouble. That's his way of telling them, she says, to fearlessly share their faith. She be a nun, having some fun, playing for a pope who brings people hope. That's the best I can do. I'm no nun. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Ashburn. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless you.